Mr. Benson here with a quick video on fractions, as this is another area where people sometimes struggle a bit if you didn't get good in fractions earlier on. It's definitely something anyone can improve on with practice, and it'll help you when you're working with algebra and equations, as fractions often come into it. Okay, what do we mean by a fraction? So we mean a number that is expressed like this. So we've got two parts that you need to be familiar with. The top line, the fancy mathematical name for that is the numerator, but usually we call it the top line. The bottom line, which often just gets called the bottom line, is the denominator. Now, fractions are generally a way of expressing numbers that aren't whole numbers. So, you know, a whole number is like 2 or 5 or 7 or whatever. Oh, that number disappeared, which was spooky. So what we mean by fractions are, you know, if I cut my apple in half, I have half an apple. So, sorry, it's being tricky on me. So I have 1 out of 2 pieces, so 1 over 2. Another important idea when you're thinking about fractions is equivalent fractions. So say I get my half of the apple and then I cut it into quarters. Well, I'm going to have 2 quarters out of 4. So 1 over 2 is the same as 2 over 4, and it's the same as 3 over 6, and what have you. Moving on, adding and subtracting fractions. Now, this is pretty easy, but there's just a couple of things we need to keep in mind. When we were talking about the denominator before, which is the bottom line, we can only add and subtract fractions if we can make if the denominator is the same, or if we can make it the same, which I'll explain later. Now in this case, these are the same. Now, nothing changes in the denominator, so it is still going to be out of 4. But we just have to think of how many quarters that we had. So I had 1 quarter here, plus 2 quarters here. I'm going to end up with 3 quarters. So we add the numerators, the denominator stays the same. Now subtraction is just this, the equivalent operation. Now my numerators are the same, so it's going to be over 4. And then I've just got to think about the numbers as I would any other equation. So 1 minus 2. Now that is going to give me minus 1 as my fraction. Negative fractions are entirely okay. Now, you will get to some like this where we've got different denominators, and that makes our lives a little bit harder, because what we need to do is to find a denominator that is common to both these fractions. Now, one important thing about a fraction is that you can change you can change it to an equivalent fraction, and as I showed on the previous page, you know, half is equivalent to 2 over 4, it's equivalent to 3 over 6, it's equivalent to 5 over 10, anything like that. So as long as we have an equivalent fraction, it still has the same value, but we might be able to get the denominator to be the same. Now, you could sit there all day and kind of go, well, what equivalent fractions of a half are going to have the same denominator as some equivalent fraction of 2/3, but the easiest way to do it is just to do some multiplication. So I'm just going to give myself a little bit more room for this. Now 2 and 3, they are not the same denominator, and so the easiest way to do this is just to find the lowest common multiple. So basically the number that we get if we multiply these together. So 2 times 3 would be 6. Now, in order to make everything on this side out of 6, I'm going to multiply it by 3 on the bottom line, so it'll be over 6. But to make it the equivalent fraction, I'll multiply it by 3 on the top line. Over here, now to make this over 3, I'm going to multiply it by over 6, sorry, I'm going to multiply it by 2, and again 2 on the top line. Now what you can see here is that I was taking my denominator from my left hand side, and I'm multiplying over here. My denominator from my right hand side, I'm multiplying over here. So we're doing this cross multiplying, and this is a pretty common idea, and there are different ways that it gets described as well, so just kind of go with whatever sort of works there. Now then what we end up with is just doing multiplication like I've shown you on the previous examples, which is pretty easy. So 1 times 3 is 3 over 2 times 3, no actually sorry, that's on the next slide. Yeah, so I'll explain multiplication on the next slide in a little bit more detail. So 2 times 3 is 6, then minus what's on the right hand side, 2 times 2 is 4, over 3 times 2 is 6. So now we have a common denominator. So we get 3 minus 4 is minus 1 over 6. Okay, now I'm back in the right order. So going to multiplication. Now I possibly should have put this earlier because in a lot of ways it's easier than the common denominator idea that we've just looked at. When we look at multiplying fractions, all we do is we look at our numerators, we multiply them together, and we look at our denominators and we multiply them together. So multiplication of numbers is, you know, is actually a fairly easy thing to do. So all I do there on my top line, I've got 1 times 2, which I know is 2. On my bottom line, I've got 4 times 4, which is 16. Now you may like to simplify these, but to be honest, it's fine leaving it as it is. And often you will do further calculations anyway where having simplified it's not really going to save you much time. So going on with this one, which is exactly the same because I didn't change anything. That was a bit silly. Let's say this is minus 2 over here. It's just the same rules apply for multiplication and directed numbers. So 1 times minus 2 will be minus 2, and 4 times 4 is 16. Now one thing that'll come up a bit and confuses people sometimes is what to do if you've got a situation like this, 1/2 times 3. Well, what you've got to remember there is that any whole number can be written as a fraction over 1. So then you have 2 numerators and 2 denominators, and it just works out exactly the same as the examples above. Dividing fractions. Dividing fractions is a little bit trickier because well, in fact, it's very difficult to do. So we cheat, if you like, and we do something which is mathematically the same but is vastly simpler. Now you've seen that multiplying is pretty easy. So what we do when we're dividing, because if you think about it, I'd have to divide 1 by 2, but that would all be over 4 divided by 4, and that's kind of hard to do, or it's a confusing way of doing it. So rather than doing it that way, what I do is I go 1 over 4 times, then I look at my second fraction, so it's 2 over 4, I invert it, so I get the reciprocal of that fraction, which is 4 over 2, and then I multiply those together. So multiplication's easy. 1 times 4 is 4, 4 times 2 is 8, so I get 4 over 8, which is a half. Okay, so same thing down here, except again I've actually not changed my answer at all. Let's do something slightly tricky here. Sorry, I'll throw in a couple of negative numbers. Should have changed my example. Okay, so same thing, 1 over minus 4. Now one thing that's worth remembering here as well is if you've got a minus sign in your denominator, you can just switch it up to the numerator, and often that'll make your life a little bit simpler, because 1 over minus 4 is exactly the same as minus 1 over 4. So that's the same as this divided by minus 2 over 4. Now I'm going to do the same trick that I did up here. I'm just going to change that to multiplying by 4 over minus 2. Now I know I've just switched a negative number down to the denominator there, but it doesn't really matter so much at the moment, and you'll see why. In fact, you could leave it on the top line in this case because it's still a negative number, and the answer you'll get would be exactly the same. Okay, minus 1 times 4 is minus 4. On the bottom line, 4 times minus 2 is minus 8. And then if you think about what I've said about division in my directed numbers video, when you've got a negative number divided by a negative number, you get a positive number. So the minuses just cancel. 4 over 8 simplifies to a half. And then same thing as I talked about on the previous one, if we're dividing by 3, and that looks a little bit unfamiliar, remember that this is 3 over 1, which means it's the same as half times 1 over 3, and so we get 1 over 6. Okay, hopefully that helps. Email me if you've got any questions.